It always starts with the things people are less likely to stand up for. Hey there, folks. So, this is a topic that at least it really kind of broke a week and a half ago, which is also when I'm filming this. Now, I'm not going to get this out that close to when a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about initially sort of happened and was revealed and started being talked about. But I'm away all next week. So, and I also didn't want to bump what I've got going for this coming weekend. So, yeah, you're getting this a little later. Things may have changed. There may be new developments that happened between when I shot this and when it was released. That having been said, I feel really confident in the aspects that I'm going to choose to focus on. So I like to think this will be useful regardless. Not to mention my overall points are kind of evergreen when it comes to this sort of stuff. What sort of stuff, you ask? Well, as you may have heard, there have been some rather swift updates to what is permitted to be placed on digital distribution platforms for video games like Steam and itch.io. More specifically, there has been a very swift removal of a number of adult-targeted games on both those platforms. And I really think it's worth digging into how that happened and why it's a problem. Now, first things first, for me, just to be upfront about something, I do actually play adult-aimed video games. In fact, I have started doing videos over on one of my other channels, the Vera Wild channel, explicitly talking about these kinds of video games and why I like them. And I've started doing reviews of some specific ones that I've played and what I did or didn't like about them. So I have a little bit of a personal interest. It's not completely detached from it. Also, anything that is a clampdown of anything related to the sex industry also impacts me because yeah, I am a sex worker. I have an OnlyFans page. So, I do have some level of investment in it on that level, but even if I didn't, I still like to think I'd talk about all this stuff. But what has happened? Let's start there. Well, the entire firestorm seems to have started from the spark lit by controversy over a game called No Mercy. This is a game that is described by its critics as YouTube, so help me if you suppress me for using the actual accurate words to describe this, rape and incest simulator. And I can't speak as to the accuracy of that, not really, because this is a game that I have not played, have no desire to play, and don't really have the ability to play at this particular point. But I will note that the defenders of the game, even its own devs, have not disputed that that kind of content is in the game. That said, I haven't really found much in the way of details for how high a percentage of the game is that sort of content, whether it is spread throughout or the whole overall point, or whether it's just an aspect of it or something that can happen. I don't know. There's only so far I want to dig into it because honestly, even if it was just a tiny portion of the game, it wouldn't matter anyway. Things that I'll talk about later will make it clear why that's the case. There is no real dispute that that kind of content is in the game, though. About the closest that the devs have come to defending it is pointing out that incest is a very popular fetish amongst pornographic material, which is factually accurate, but also basically amounts to, well, everybody else is doing it, which is not the best defense. Now, the devs voluntarily removed the game from Steam in April. Now, that's an interesting detail because, in theory, a group that we are going to be talking about a lot called Collective Shout initially started this entire push because of that specific game. But the game got removed in April. And the changes to what was allowed and the policy changes on Steam and itch.io happened in July. So, for some reason, the removal of the specific game that they were all real upset about didn't seem to satisfy them. So at my time of speaking, both Steam and itch removed a large number of games, and in some cases even banned developer accounts over changes to their policies. Developers were given no notice and no heads up on this, which means they were given no chance to update, amend, or otherwise change their games to possibly remove some content. Again, if it wasn't like the main point of the game, they never got the chance to remove it and amend it to be able to fit new policies. Then again, given the nature of the policy wording, especially on Steam, it might not have made a difference anyway. See, the thing is, Steam didn't actually lay out new rules. What it did is it updated its terms to read that it would remove, quote, content that may violate the rules and standards set forth by Steam's payment processors and related card networks and banks or internet service providers, in particular certain kinds of adult content. Now, the first thing is this basically kicks responsibility for actually laying out what isn't allowed to a whole bunch of other entities, despite the fact that Steam's the one that has removed this stuff. But they're laying the need to actually lay out rules and what is or isn't allowed on the feet of internet providers and banks and payment processors, despite the fact that few, if any, of these entities are actually going to have publicly stated policies about what is allowed in video game distribution for clients of theirs. So that's deeply unhelpful. What exactly are, quote, certain kinds of adult-only content? Who the hell knows? Now, in talking about Steam, most of what has actually been removed were admittedly very low effort visual novels, usually only selling for a few bucks, very low engagement, very few reviews, not very long in play, and again, a lot of those tended to have incest theming. It's not exactly content I would go out of my way to defend, although, hold on to that thought, we're going to circle back to it a little bit down the road. It's worth noting that any game of this nature was already required to be appropriately marked as being for adult audiences only. So the issue is not that kids had access to this, because in theory, they shouldn't. You can debate how successful any age-gating policies or techniques are, but they do exist. And in theory, kids aren't supposed to have access. And honestly, the objections don't really list the issue of it being accessible to kids. The issue is that it exists at all. Hold on to that one too. We're going to come back to that one in fairly short order. Meanwhile, over on itch.io, things look even more scorched earth, with porn-themed games as well as an award-winning independent game about eating disorders all being caught up in the purge. And that just shows how little effort was put into actually being sure what they were or weren't taking down. Reminds me of how references to the Enola Gay were removed from government websites because they were purging any reference to queerness with a hedge trimmer. The group claiming credit for this is called Collective Shout. They are based out of Australia, and I say it that way, claims responsibility, because it's kind of difficult to parse exactly how much a group like this is directly influencing what's going on and how much of it is just things that they were pushing for now happen to be going on anyway, and they are just claiming credit so they can make it look like they are the ones driving this. Because whether they are truly responsible or not, they are without question a public pressure group in the vein of things like Exodus Cry, which is a group I have not only talked about before in this video, if you want to go back and get more details on them, but also is a group that Collective Shout openly affiliates with, so I don't make that connection idly. Before I get into too many further details about this group, because you're probably not going to like them, let me emphasize, don't harass them. Don't harass the group as a whole. Don't harass the individuals involved. It shouldn't need to be said, but for all the criticism I'm about to lay at their feet, I do believe them when they write about having been harassed by people who claim to be gamers. I've been in the crosshairs of the gamers TM, and I know what that's like, and I don't wish it on anybody. So, just don't. Now, as is usually the case with these kinds of groups, I don't want to say I blanketly oppose absolutely everything they have ever claimed to stand for. They push for Andrew Tate's podcast to be removed from Spotify, no big loss, and if I actually had the ability to play No Mercy for myself, I suspect that I would find a game that I would not exactly be missing or bemoaning the loss of. But what is important to remember is that groups like this use these kinds of games and these kinds of things that most people agree like, well, yeah, no, that's not that great a thing. They're not just trying to get rid of those things. They are using those as the thin point of the wedge. And they get that in so that they can push bigger, more substantive changes that people might not agree to if they were more aware. This is not Collective Shout's first time targeting a video game, and it's actually worth highlighting the last time that they did it, because it's kind of revealing of a few things about them. They previously went after the game Detroit Become Human. Now, as with No Mercy, I've not played it, and I also wouldn't intend to. One, it's not my kind of game. Two, the studio behind it has a rather horrifying reputation when it comes to work culture, and the actual director is, frankly, just a garbage pile of a human being. That being said, Detroit Become Human, unlike No Mercy, is big enough to have multiple places where I can go to find synopses, summations, playthroughs, etc., so I am in a much better position to assess Collective Shout's claims about the game. Now, their issue that they brought up in a petition on change.org was the depiction of child abuse. And it really is that straightforward. It was the depiction existing at all. For context, one of the multiple storylines in the game involves an abusive father. And in this storyline, the player character is a housekeeping android. The plot of this storyline involves the player character escaping from the household with the child, thereby rescuing her from the abuse. So, whether or not you feel this abuse angle is handled respectfully, given the track record of the developer, I'd be inclined to say probably not, but it doesn't seem to be designed to be exploitative and certainly not designed to be enticing in any way. And yet Collective Shout just labeled it as entertainment, which is technically true. A game is a piece of entertainment, but that particular part of the game was meant to be harrowing, not fun. And clearly this context did not matter to Collective Shout, and they obfuscate the presentation by citing the death of the girl at the hands of the father as if it's an inescapable part of the plot, when in fact it is a failure state and one of the many bad endings that you can get in the game. They don't care that the work was condemning abuse and that the player's goal was to liberate the child from it. They only cared that abuse was depicted at all. And as a rancid little icing on this nonsense cake, they cite a retired psychologist making a general statement about games and the impact they have on kids by involving them in the violence, when again, in this case, the player character is at most a witness to the violence and not a participant, but more importantly, the game was rated for mature audiences in all territories, including Australia, so kids weren't supposed to be playing it anyway, which was naturally another detail Collective Shout neglected to mention. Because groups like this, who always tout the save the children thing, they have a baseline argument. Whether they believe it or not, they argue from a position that if literally any child is ever able to get a hold of this stuff, no matter what guidelines or safety features or measures are currently in play, if any child can get a hold of it, even if they do so by skirting the rules, then it shouldn't exist at all. That's the way they operate. So it doesn't matter that it's marked for adults, that it's restricted, that there are other things in place to try and keep it out of the hands of children. That doesn't matter. If it exists, they want it gone. There were a couple of really great write-ups about all of this on Vice by Anna Valens. Amongst other things, she went over the issues of unverifiable and outright false claims made by both Collective Shout and groups that they freely affiliate with. The thing is, neither of these articles are up on Vice anymore. Both were taken down, and according to Valens, due to concerns over the subject matter. Now, to be clear, there were no concerns about the accuracy of her reporting, only about the controversial nature of the subject matter. The problem wasn't that she said anything wrong or inaccurate, but it's that she talked about it at all. That was apparently enough for Vice's parent company to say, shut it down. This preemptive capitulation to groups like Collective Shout shows that these parent companies don't want to deal with the often aggressive pushback that these groups give whenever they are faced with any, frequently very valid, criticism. That's what these groups do. They make themselves such a headache that nobody wants to deal with them. And so they preemptively capitulate. Thankfully, both articles are archived, and I will link to them in a pinned comment below. So we've talked a bit about the services impacted, and we've started to dig into the organization that claims credit. Let's dig a little further onto Collective Shout. Because even a cursory glance at their About page raises a fair few red flags. I could go point for point through this entire page, but let's jump to the biggest issue. The claim that they are evidence-based. In this section, they cite two and only two sources to back up their claims of having scientific basis for what they're after. And please keep in mind and imagine the word cite in the biggest sarcasm quotes that you can possibly picture. The first problem is, naturally, they do not link to the cited works, or indeed do they accurately name them. They name the author of the first and a co-author of the second, and do some quotes and summation, but the vagueness with which all this is done made tracking down what it is they're even citing a truly infuriating process for me. First, there's the meta-analysis by L. Monique Ward from 2016. The actual title of the work is Media and Sexualization, State of Empirical Research, 1995 to 2015. Part of why it was so hard for me to find the thing, even aside from the fact that the title wasn't given and there was no link, is they also quote or claim to quote something from this particular meta-analysis, but they misquote it. So when I tried to find anything with that exact quote, the only hit that I got back was their exact site. Well, that and a recommendation from Google AI for a blog for a completely different thing. But, I'm not going to dig into that because one, it wasn't even the same quote, and two, screw Google AI. But the quote, or rather the misquote as Collective Shout has it, reads, consistent evidence that everyday exposure to sexually objectifying content is directly associated with higher levels of body dissatisfaction, greater self-objectification, greater support of sexist beliefs, and greater tolerance of violence towards women. Now, when I did find the actual article and the original quote, the misquoting is not so egregious as to flatly change the meaning, but it eliminates a handful of phrases and summarizes a few others, which would be fine if they hadn't presented it on their page in quotes, because when you use quotes, you need to put the exact words of what you're quoting. You don't get to change it and summarize and scratch things out. That's admittedly a little bit of a petty gripe, partly because that misquote made my job a heck of a lot harder, but also once I found it brought up a whole new set of issues. Collective Shout puts forward that, quote, the research concluded that experimental exposure to this content leads both women and men to have a diminished view of women's competence, morality, and humanity. Firstly, it's not research. This is not a research paper. It is a meta-analysis of existing research papers. Secondly, they say the research concluded and then cite a quote that is from the second to last sentence in the summary that appears once again in the body of the work, neither of which is the conclusion because there's actually a section at the end with a heading for conclusion, and it doesn't say that. You want to know what it does say? The media landscape is changing and the ways in which media are used are changing. We as researchers need to continue both to address traditional questions about the effects of objectifying media and to incorporate these exciting new ones. Because again, this wasn't an actual study, it was a study of the studies. It was going over the methodology of these kinds of studies and what its actual conclusions were about the sorts of things being studied and if there was a better way to address it in the future. Not to actually draw a conclusion about the bodies of research. Of course, the other thing is that this is analysis of studies done from 1995 to 2015, as it says in the title, and is, I suspect, a possible reason why they didn't list the title, because that was a decade ago. And the first question most people will have would be, is there anything newer than that? More recent meta-analyses probably do exist somewhere, but I didn't find any actual follow-ups done by L. Monique Ward, the researcher who assembled this particular meta-analysis. So it's not like she came back to this 10 years later and went, how has it changed? How has it improved? She just hasn't done that. And I was not going to go digging through all the bodies of research trying to find if anybody else had done that. Collective Shout didn't bother to do it. Why should I? And just for the record, L. Monique Ward does appear to be a legitimate researcher with a long history of contributing to studies on sexualization, though this kind of meta-analysis is the vast minority of what she does, and usually she's involved in individual studies with fairly narrow focuses. So we have a reworded quote from an improperly cited meta-analysis being talked about as if it's the actual grounds level research, calling something a conclusion that was only part of the initial description and once in the body of the piece, but is not the actual conclusion that the thing comes to. Next, we have a citation from, quote, a 2019 publication by the American Psychological Association, co-authored by Our Watch's Elise Holland, which also took me a while to track down because, again, they didn't link it or name it. For the record, the study is called How Does It Feel to Be Treated Like an Object? Direct and Indirect Effects of Exposure to Sexual Objectification on Women's Emotions in Daily Life. Now, I wasn't able to give this one as thorough a look as the meta-analysis was, partly because I couldn't find a way to access it without having to buy a copy of the document from the APA, but also because the claims made by Collective Shout about this article are way more vague and far less concrete anyway. There wouldn't really be much for me to be checking against, if you know what I mean. Now, after these two flimsy citations, Collective Shout then proceeds to basically present their own conclusions and toot their own horn a bit. All of this, again, under the heading of how they are evidence-based. Now, let's be clear about something with Collective Shout. They're not wrong that excessive sexual objectification is bad. They're also probably not wrong that it is in such excess and done so casually in a lot of our society that increases the problems. But there's a very telling phrase that shows up in the About section that they never bother to define: pornification of culture and porn culture. This is an extremely common tactic of groups like this, to equate virtually anything they don't like with pornography. Because generally, groups like this, whether they say so up front or not, want to outlaw porn. But in addition to that, their definition of porn probably extends a lot farther than yours or mine does. But they won't tell you that if they can get away with it. And if they do, they're not going to tell you that up front. The aforementioned Exodus Cry, for instance, explicitly links all sex trafficking to what they call the, quote, commercial sex industry, which porn comfortably falls under, and they want all of that criminalized. They don't lead with, we want all porn to be made illegal, but that is explicitly part of their agenda. And while I could not find similar statements on Collective Shout's page, they are freely associating with Exodus Cry and employing very similar tactics. And if you take a look at the list of Collective Shout's quote-unquote wins, their actual agenda, supposedly to combat objectification in popular culture, becomes a lot clearer, as virtually everything they target is small and niche, and it frankly makes them look exceedingly petty. We already know about their campaigns against games. Additionally, they pushed a venture capital group to divest from strip clubs, the aforementioned removal of Andrew Tate's podcast, harassing a Queensland-based hotel to cancel a Playboy-themed event. Not cancel an event that benefited or explicitly involved Playboy, just a Playboy-themed one. They pushed an Australia-based chain to no longer sell shirts with Pornhub on them. They campaigned against a vegan bakery for offering cookies with raunchy messaging. They have an ongoing campaign to attempt to stop the sale of what they call child sex abuse dolls from Temu, of all places. Now, this is a product that I'm not going to dispute the existence of, but it is something I had literally never heard of until I started digging into this stuff with Collective Shout, and it is something that appears to be one of the group's obsessions. They've had a multi-year-long campaign against a regional lingerie chain called Honey Birdette and trying to break up the partnering that they have done with breast cancer charities, because being a lingerie chain, they have gone about their promotion of those charities in a way that Collective Shout doesn't like. And they've targeted various Australian-based businesses, including a hot sauce brand, a Thai restaurant, a skincare brand, a Gold Coast hotel location, a luxury fashion brand, the International Handball Federation, and an extreme vendetta with anyone and any company that has any amount of stock in Playboy. Because yes, Playboy is certainly at the height of its cultural influence these days. We all know that, right? Again, I might even agree with a handful of these, but you have to grant me, it makes sense that they're touting the victories on Steam and itch.io so loudly because all their other stuff just seems so small-minded. So that's the kind of group we're dealing with. A group that just shouts. Like, their name's very appropriate. Their goal is to motivate the people who are associated with them and to get other people to sign petitions, often by mis- or underrepresenting things, as we very clearly saw with the Detroit Become Human petition. And they want as many voices as possible saying what they want said, to be as loud as possible, to shout as loud as possible, to, frankly, bully businesses, most of which are just these small local Australian businesses. This is the kind of group we're dealing with. So why is this working? This should be something we can laugh off. Like, the Detroit Become Human thing went nowhere. Why is it working now? Well, a couple of reasons. The first is persistence. They and groups like them have been doing this for a very long time. But it is worth asking, even beyond persistence, why are payment processors leaning in their favor? Because, let's be clear, payment processors, Visa, PayPal, banks, whatever, they are amoral entities, as any corporation is. They don't care about the supposed moral implications of these things, and they're not stopping supporting them because they have an actual moral objection. Some individuals at these companies, even higher up in these companies, might, but the company collectively as a whole does not care. So you could see that this could easily lean the other way. They're presented with a situation in which, okay, so our services are being used to assist and facilitate the purchase of these adult items. Like, for the moment, let's focus on the video games. These video games are being bought through processing through our services, and these people are objecting to it. Now, the way they have been leaning is, okay, so to placate these people, we're going to force the folks actually using our payment processing to remove, modify, or otherwise crack down on that kind of content. And we can get away with doing that because they need our services. They can't just boycott us. They need it, and so they will bow to our whims and capitulate to us. But you could just as easily imagine a world in which they went, look, we are making money off of this, and these people who are shouting at us about it, it's not like they can boycott all payment processing services, not in any number that is going to be greater than the money we make facilitating these sales. We don't have to bend to them. They just have to suck it up. But that's not the way they're leaning. Instead, they're leaning on these outlets like Steam and Itch and previously OnlyFans, like in that video that I made before that I mentioned. They're leaning on them and going, okay, well, you have to just suck it up. Why are they leaning that way? Because it really does feel like it could at least go either way. If not, it seems like it would be in their favor to continue doing the business. That makes the money, right? Well, it does. But there's another factor beyond just the persistence of groups like Collective Shout. There's the fact that almost nobody will vocally take up the opposing position. To be blunt about it, people don't want to stand up for porn. How many people would actually put their name on a petition that says, we support porn? Well, not that it's the best metric in the world, but we can look at change.org to get a sense of what those numbers are like. There are multiple campaigns on there trying to push back against Collective Shout. The most successful one has a grand total of 836 signatures at time of recording, and it pushes hard on the issue of Collective Shout apparently defending the controversial film Cuties, which I am only bringing up here so that people don't bring it up in the comments. I haven't seen Cuties, and much like No Mercy, I have no intent or desire to ever see Cuties. Therefore, I cannot assess it as a piece of work. I cannot assess its potential merits or exactly what is wrong with it. I know what people have said about it. I'm not interested in dealing with it. Therefore, I have no opinion on whether or not it was a thing worth defending or whether or not there is nuance worth defending. I'm not dealing with it. We're moving on. Another one of the petitions is targeted at web hosts, trying to get them to stop supporting Collective Shout, which would effectively take down their website. This is a tactic that's been used elsewhere and saw some success, if only temporarily, with sites like Kiwi Farms, and that one has a total of 17 signatures. And finally, a petition to save the game No Mercy in specific has all of 15 signatures. In comparison, Collective Shout petitions get tens of thousands of signatures. Even their unsuccessful one against Detroit Become Human hit 36K. My point is, there are way more people willing to put their name on a petition that says, ban this sick filth, than there are people willing to put their name on a petition that says, protect this sick filth. And that relative imbalance is all they need in order to get their wins. They don't have to be an actual majority. They just need to appear to be one. And this is how they do that. It is a timeless tactic going back to the moral majority in the US back in the 80s. They were never the actual majority. They weren't then, they aren't now, but they were loud and they were organized. And the number of people willing to say that they were in favor of what these people were saying they were against wasn't high. That's not to say that most people didn't believe that these guys were morons who needed to shut up. But they didn't feel that strongly enough to put their name on a sheet and go, I believe this. They may not have agreed, but they also weren't willing to fight. And that is all that is necessary. These groups are single-minded, very loud, and very capable of mobilizing their backers. If you can get a group of several thousand to send angry letters to a local business, those businesses will fold to your demands. If you can get tens of thousands to put pressure on larger businesses when there's virtual silence on the opposing view, you can get them to give you what you want if you keep at it for long enough. Almost nobody is willing to be openly pro-sex work or pro-porn. Very much in the same way that almost nobody has been willing to be pro-abortion. I don't want you to think that this comparison is crass. It's a very similar tactic. The sense of shame associated with abortion was something that the anti-abortion side was able to instill even on the vocal supporters of the right to abortion, because they would get the supporters to talk in shameful terms even as they were defending it. They would go, okay, yes, it is awful that it's a thing that's necessary at all, but we do think that it should be available. And it would become this far, far softer defense of it than the attack, which was relentless. When it came to access for abortions, even people who defended it and wanted that to be a maintained right would almost never have the guts to say, this is a good thing, it's not shameful, and there isn't a damn thing wrong with getting one. Though it's worth noting, to say that these people are anti-sex work or anti-porn would be to actually adopt their framing. They're not either of those things, or at least they are not only those things. What they are is anti-speech, anti-choice, and above all, pro-control. They don't want to protect women. They want to use societal harm of women in order to control everybody. It is done in the name of women and children to try and force those calling them out as appearing to be pro-abuse. Not to dwell on the comparison again, but this was why anti-abortion groups latched onto the term pro-life, because that term at the very least implies that those who oppose them were anti-life and pro-death. And to bring it back to Collective Shout, again, some of the specific campaigns that they've run, the more narrowly focused things they've campaigned for, I'd even be inclined to agree with on a one-off basis, but I know none of it is actually sincere. They are the kind of group that decided first what the thing was that they hated and wanted gone, and then came up with the justifications for why they can get rid of it. It bears more than a passing resemblance to anti-trans groups in places like the UK, who will claim to be there to support women's rights, but they will never campaign or fight for equal pay, better domestic violence laws, better representation in media or in politics. They only ever push for anti-trans bills. They will claim that they want to help women when all they do is attack trans people. Because attacking trans people is the point, defending women is the excuse. And it is the same with a group like Collective Shout. Getting rid of porn, or what they consider to be porn, is the point, and protecting women from objectification is the excuse. It's a retcon, and it's all given away by the fact that none of their so-called wins are about benefiting support groups or attacking the general inequality that comes in any patriarchal society. It's just about what they consider porn and what aspects of it they've gone after lately. In the case of both Collective Shout and these anti-trans groups and these anti-sex trafficking groups like Exodus Cry that aren't really about stopping sex trafficking, this is all a cover. It is a stepping stone for what they actually want to do, which is to control people. They want to create a world controlled by morally righteous prudes who hate what they find distasteful and what they don't understand and want to criminalize its existence. And what's extra frustrating is that because groups like this claim to be feminist, it fuels the persecution complex held by reactionary self-proclaimed gamers that blue-haired feminazis are here to take our games away.
Fucking pronouns!
I don't know what the individual political positions of the women who are listed on the board of Collective Shout actually are, but these kinds of groups are inherently, innately, and undeniably conservative. They're not liberal, and they're sure as hell not leftist. Hey, so a quick thing about not knowing the political leanings of the individual members. I did actually come across at least one thing that I found rather interesting, which is that the founder of this entire thing is staunchly anti-abortion, like she's written multiple books on the topic. It seems to have been her primary concern before returning to anti-porn. Now, I've seen claims of anti-queer and TERF talking points showing up in the social media of some of these people, but the thing was, there was only so many of these people's social media presences I was going to comb through, and to be clear, I will not be shocked if somebody in the comments points me directly to anti-trans talking points said by these people, but I'm just saying I didn't find that. That having been said, I will re-emphasize that they partner with Exodus Cry as well as NCOSE, which is another organization that claims to not be anti-queer, however, has been at the heart of some of the big pushes for anti-queer laws in Africa in the last few years. So yeah, this is all pretty far-right nonsense. At best, they are happy to partner with that, if not engage in it directly. And I, for one, am not going to give them even that much benefit of the doubt. Left-leaning media critics pointing out harmful tropes were never trying to take your games away. Anita Sarkeesian never tried to get a game banned. She only wanted people to be more aware of the content of media and larger trends. And she wasn't even very good at it, but that's not the point. I myself have called for people to be more aware of the tropes in certain kinds of works and certain specific works, but I've never actually called for a boycott of anything, not even Harry Potter. People claim that I did, but I never actually did. All I ever asked was that people be aware and understand. And that is the general position of media analysis that these frickin' outrage merchants claim that people who do media analysis are in fact trying to ban your games when you have these groups out here actually doing it. What you do or don't like in your media does not make you a good or bad person. How you engage with it and how you deal with how you talk about and or defend that media might say something about whether or not you're a good person, but that is a much bigger topic that I actually plan to tackle a little bit down the line, so we're going to move on. Now, whether Collective Shout is as insidious as something like Exodus Cry, or whether they're simply useful idiots who don't realize the kind of people they're helping, is impossible to say and ultimately doesn't matter. These kinds of groups are getting louder, and as they get louder and not enough people push back on it, they will continue to see success. They need to be called out, highlighted, pushed back against, and told that they're wrong. And when they are, the pieces doing that need to not be taken down by parent companies. And this is not because they are trying to take your porn away, although, make no mistake, they absolutely are, but it's because they are trying to build a world in which the only permissible things to show or see or be are the things that they find acceptable. And nothing else. Their campaign against Honey Burdette probably illustrates that best. It didn't matter that this lingerie brand raised money to fight breast cancer. All that mattered was that they did it in a way Collective Shout felt was porny, and therefore it must be attacked. If you fit their view of porny, then you shouldn't exist. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what good you bring into the world. Now, aside from the general notion of we need to push back, is there anything concrete we could do? Maybe. I feel like a lot of people just assume like sex sells, people are making money. It's not gonna go away. We don't have to fight for that. But that just made you complacent, like with so many other things. Something is the way that it is long enough and we just assume, oh, that won't change. Oh, abortion settled law. They won't change that. Porn has been available for decades. And like the practice of porn and sex work in general has been around forever. They won't just get rid of that. Yeah, they will. They'll try, at the very least, and they'll do it louder and louder and more persistently and for longer. And if they do it long enough and loud enough and nobody is saying the other position that this stuff is fine and I support its existence, then things like payment processors will start kowtowing to them if only to shut them up for 5 minutes. Not that that's actually going to work, because appeasement never works. It was never about just the game No Mercy. They didn't stop there. They will never stop with any one of their wins. That's why they list so many of these tiny petty victories, because it's never about those things. These are just tiny stepping stones for much bigger things, and you will not get them to stop by letting them have a little bit of ground. You give them an inch, they'll take a mile, and they will take that mile with an eye on taking the entire goddamn planet. These groups will frequently admit that it is always about much bigger goals and much more sweeping changes, not just their opening line, because their opening line is, oh, just sign our petition that says this game with these things that most people agree are bad is in fact bad. That's what they open with, but that's not what they're doing. To most people's eyes, yes, indeed, game bad. I'll put name on petition. And most who sign will never look into the larger goals of these groups. I'm going to inject some stuff here because things aren't quite as dire as I felt they were when I initially shot this video. Speaking of the ACLU, they have a petition that at time of recording has already surpassed its 150,000 signature goal, which is significantly more than any petition that has ever been put forward by Collective Shout that I could find. And while this is harder for me to confirm, there is word of both Visa and MasterCard being overwhelmed with complaints about this. Polycon did an article talking about how gamers are up in arms, but the thing is, this is not and should not be just gamers. This is not about games. This is about corporations deciding what we can and can't engage with, and it has nothing to do with legality. This is really important. I looked up MasterCard's full policies, and they have a section for illegal or brand-damaging transactions. It's really fascinating that they lump those together at all, that they will consider brand-damaging stuff just as bad as illegal. But let's take a quick look at this highlighted area. The sale of product or service, including an image which is potentially offensive and lacks artistic value, such as, by way of example and not limitation, and it then proceeds to list a bunch of stuff that is in fact illegal. So they are trying to hide behind the idea, well, this is stuff that isn't legal to buy anyway. And of course they shouldn't be facilitating purchases of stuff that is illegal to own in the first dang place. However, they do not lay out what their moral guidelines are, and the wording of this basically allowed them to decide, as an amoral entity having people with completely varying morals from day to day or case to case, making individual decisions about what constitutes no artistic value. This wording means they get to decide something is wrong and you shouldn't have it, even though it is not illegal. They're actually kind of pulling a similar trick to what Collective Shout does. Because while Collective Shout highlights the worst instance of a game that they could find and then use that as a blanket excuse to ban a ton of stuff, MasterCard lists a bunch of actually illegal stuff, but uses that as their excuse for why they can stop any transaction that they don't like on their moral grounds, which they do not define. And if this was a case of we could just take our business elsewhere, it wouldn't be such a problem. But MasterCard and Visa effectively have a monopoly. Not just on credit card services, most banks run their debit cards through one of these two companies. When payment processors decide that they will not allow a certain kind of purchase, that is an effective banning. The ultimate problem is these corporations hold way too much power and too much of the market, but, we're not going to tackle that one today. But to circle back to the ACLU petition, which I am going to link below, this does seem to have actually stirred up the kind of anger that is needed. And the ACLU is a great organization to back for this because they were able to word a petition in a way that actually got people invested, as opposed to the people who were putting stuff up on change.org and getting no results because, well, they're not organizers. They're just angry individuals. Your anger is valid, but is best directed by helping boost people who are better organized. So yeah, maybe we can push back on this. If not to reverse the stuff that's already happened, at least scare them off from pushing further. And at this point, I, for one, will take that. These groups are continuing to see success, and we need to call it what it is when it happened, because otherwise it's just one more stepping stone in what they're trying to accomplish overall, which is a more restrictive, less free, and more tightly controlled world that is shaped how they want it with no consideration for anybody else. So yeah, this was a fun topic. A lot of them have been lately. I wish I could say we're going to start covering fun stuff soon. I would love to. I don't want to lie to you. But thank you for listening. Whatever your thoughts are on any of this, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living, even if you can't help me out that way. Like, share, subscribe. Those all help. Don't worry too much about it, though. What I really want you to remember: you are beautiful. You are valid. You are loved. Porn is valid. Sex work is work. You are the council, and I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Jared Boyce, Zubin Lutfulla, Auntie Kate 808, Mira G, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, Movie Turtle, Oliver B, Sean Miller, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Melissa Pedersen, Mary Mello, Becky Sparks, Loki Eris, Tracy Scrabbit, Pal Barabajoggle, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. Don't worry, the rats are all fine, but my rat wrangler is not here right now, and I thought we could have Archie say hi. Or not.